Between 1854 and 1929, over 200,000 children vanished from America's eastern cities, shipped westward on trains to destinations unknown. The official story calls it a rescue mission, but what if the greatest child welfare program in American history was actually something far darker? They called it placing out, a compassionate solution to the orphan crisis overwhelming New York, Boston, and Philadelphia in the late 1800s. Charitable organizations promised these children new lives with loving families on the frontier. Newspapers celebrated it as progressive reform. Society pages praised the benevolent sponsors. But the children who rode those trains told different stories. Stories of siblings torn apart, never to see each other again. Of identities erased and pasts rewritten. Of standing on platforms while strangers examined their teeth and muscles like livestock at auction. Many never spoke of their experiences at all, carrying silence to their graves. Now, over a century later, descendants are uncovering documents that challenge everything we thought we knew. Hidden letters reveal systematic deception. Census records show patterns that contradict official narratives, and researchers are asking uncomfortable questions. Were these really orphans? Where did they actually go? And why were so many records destroyed? The emotional journey from charitable rescue to potential exploitation forces us to confront a disturbing possibility that one of America's most celebrated social programs may have been a mechanism for child trafficking, free labor, and the systematic erasure of the urban poor. In 1853, a young minister named Charles Loring Brace walked through the Five Points neighborhood of Manhattan and saw what he believed was a crisis threatening the very soul of America. Thousands of children roamed the streets, sleeping in alleyways, stealing food to survive, forming gangs that terrified respectable citizens. These were the children of immigrants, of the desperately poor, of families shattered by disease and industrial accidents. Brace saw them as both victims and threats, innocents who would become criminals if something wasn't done immediately. His solution was radical for its time. Rather than building more orphanages or asylums, Brace proposed sending these children west to farm families who would raise them as their own. He founded the Children's Aid Society in 1853 and launched the first orphan train in 1854, convinced he was saving children from lives of poverty and vice while simultaneously providing the expanding frontier with young workers who would grow into productive citizens. In his writings, Brace painted an almost biblical vision of redemption, plucking children from the moral cesspool of urban slums and delivering them to wholesome Christian homes where fresh air, honest labor, and family values would transform them into upstanding Americans. The newspapers loved it. Society women organized fundraising galas. Churches praised the Children's Aid Society as doing God's work. The public narrative was irresistible. Innocent waifs rescued from certain doom, given second chances with families who wanted them. Illustrations in magazines showed grateful children embracing their new mothers, living happily ever after on prosperous farms. Testimonials from satisfied families appeared regularly, describing how these children had enriched their lives. But the children themselves told different stories when they were allowed to speak at all. They described being cleaned, dressed in donated clothing, and loaded onto trains with tags pinned to their coats like parcels being shipped. Many had been told they were going on trips and would return home.
Some had parents who were simply too poor to feed them and had been promised their children would be educated and returned. When the train stopped at small town stations, the children were lined up on platforms while townspeople circled them, squeezing their arms to test for strength, checking their teeth, asking them to run or lift heavy objects. Those who were shy or sickly often weren't chosen at all, forced back onto the train to try again at the next stop. Brothers and sisters frequently watched each other disappear into different wagons, heading to different farms, never to meet again. The children were told to forget their old names, their old families, their old lives. This was their fresh start, agents explained, and looking backward would only bring sadness. What Brace called rescue, many children experienced as abduction. What society celebrated as charity, they endured as loss.
The word orphan conjures images of children with no one, no mother, no father, no family at all. But researchers combing through historical records have discovered a troubling pattern. Many children sent west on the orphan trains had at least one living parent, and some had two. The definition of orphan used by the Children's Aid Society and similar organizations was remarkably elastic, stretching to include any child deemed neglected, abandoned, or living in unsuitable conditions. A father working 16-hour shifts in a factory and unable to supervise his children during the day could find them classified as abandoned. A widowed mother struggling to feed her family might be told her children would be better off elsewhere. Poverty itself became a form of parental unfitness. The consent forms that supposedly documented parental permission raise more questions than they answer. Many were signed with X marks by illiterate parents who couldn't read what they were agreeing to. Others were written entirely in English and presented to non-English-speaking immigrants who relied on translators, often representatives of the very organizations taking their children. Some parents later claimed they'd been told their children would receive education and job training in the city, not that they'd be sent hundreds of miles away. Others said they'd agreed to temporary placement during illness or hardship, expecting their children to return within months. Instead, their children vanished into the vast American interior with no forwarding addresses, their names changed, their records sealed or destroyed. Certain communities seemed to be targeted with particular intensity. Irish and Italian immigrant neighborhoods experienced waves of child removals, often following visits from charitable organizations or truancy officers. The message was clear. These foreign parents, with their strange customs and crowded tenements, were unfit to raise American children. Taking their children wasn't cruelty, it was cultural rescue. Jewish families in the Lower East Side reported similar experiences, watching their children absorbed into Christian households across the Midwest, their religious identities erased along with their surnames. Even more disturbing are the documented cases that suggest outright kidnapping. Court records from the era include testimonies from parents who claimed their children were taken while playing in the streets or removed from schools without notification. Some parents spent years searching, placing desperate advertisements in newspapers across multiple states, offering rewards for information. The few who managed to track down their children often found that reunification was legally impossible. The children had been legally adopted, their birth records altered or destroyed, their memories of their original families dismissed as confusion or fantasy. The documentation gaps are both convenient and suspicious.
When descendants try to trace their orphan train ancestors, they frequently hit walls. Intake records are missing, placement documents have disappeared, the organizations that ran the trains either no longer exist or claim their archives were lost to fires, floods, or simple negligence. What survives are fragments, just enough to confirm the children existed, but rarely enough to answer where they truly came from or whether anyone was looking for them.
The trains would arrive in small Midwestern towns with little warning, sometimes announced only by handbills posted at the general store or church. Townspeople gathered at the station as if attending a county fair, curious and eager, ready to inspect the merchandise that charitable organizations from the East had shipped their way. The children, exhausted from days of travel, were scrubbed clean one final time, their hair combed, their donated clothes straightened. Then they were lined up on the platform or marched into the town hall, standing in rows while strangers circled them with appraising eyes. First-hand accounts from survivors paint a picture that's difficult to reconcile with the narrative of charitable placement. One woman, interviewed in her 80s, recalled standing on a platform in Iowa in 1889 while farmers squeezed her arms and examined her hands for calluses. A man in Nebraska remembered being told to open his mouth so a prospective father could check his teeth. Children were asked to lift heavy objects to demonstrate they could work. Girls were inspected for domestic potential. Were they docile, obedient, suitable for kitchen labor? Boys were valued for strength and stamina, their worth measured in how much field work they could perform. The weak, the sickly, the ones who cried or seemed defiant, they watched as healthier children were claimed, led away to wagons, disappearing into new lives while they remained unwanted.
The preference was brutally clear: young enough to be molded, old enough to work. Infants were rarely taken. They required too much care and gave nothing back for years. Teenagers were often rejected, too, already formed, potentially rebellious, less time before they'd leave anyway. The sweet spot was somewhere between 6 and 12, old enough for chores but young enough to forget where they came from. Blonde, blue-eyed children were selected first in many towns, while darker-complexioned children faced rejection after rejection, eventually shipped further west in hopes of finding someone willing to take them. What happened to the children nobody wanted remains one of the darkest mysteries of the orphan train era. Some were sent back east to institutions, having failed at their one chance for family placement. Others were passed from town to town, riding the trains until someone, anyone, agreed to take them. A few records mention children being placed in what were euphemistically called work homes, essentially labor camps where unwanted children provided free industrial or agricultural work. Some simply disappeared from records entirely after multiple failed placements, their fates unknown. The comparisons to slave auctions, while uncomfortable, are historically documented. Some survivors themselves made this connection, describing their experiences in precisely these terms. Abolitionists of the era occasionally protested the orphan trains using this very language, pointing out that displaying human beings for selection based on their physical attributes and labor potential had a recent and shameful precedent in American history. The Children's Aid Society vehemently denied any similarity, insisting these were adoption proceedings, not sales. But no money changed hands at slave auctions either, just labor, extracted over years from people who had no choice in the matter.
The erasure began with names. Children who boarded trains as Giuseppe became Joseph, Siobhan became Susan, Yitzhak became Isaac, or sometimes just John. The agents explained this was for the children's own good. American names would help them fit in, give them better chances in their new communities. But the practice went deeper than simple anglicization. Birth certificates, when they existed at all, were often altered or replaced entirely. A child's age might shift by 2 or 3 years, depending on what potential families wanted. A scrawny 10-year-old became 8 to seem more adoptable. A mature-looking 13-year-old became 15 to justify immediate field labor. These weren't clerical errors, but systematic revisions, making it nearly impossible for children to ever reconstruct their true origins. The separation of siblings was perhaps the cruelest aspect of this identity erasure. Brothers and sisters who had survived poverty, disease, and loss together were deliberately split apart, placed with different families in different towns, sometimes different states. The justification offered by placing agencies was coldly practical. Families preferred one child to multiple, and siblings might cling to each other rather than bonding with their new families. Children were told their brothers and sisters had gone to wonderful homes, and they should be happy, not sad. No reunion information was provided. No forwarding addresses were kept. When children asked about siblings years later, they were often told that looking backward was unhealthy, that they should focus on their new lives and forget the past. Some grew up not even knowing they had siblings at all, the information deliberately withheld.
Religious and ethnic identity received similar treatment. Jewish children from New York's Lower East Side found themselves in Methodist homes in Kansas, their heritage erased overnight. Catholic children were placed with Protestant families, despite protests from Catholic charities, who eventually started their own orphan trains specifically to prevent this cultural conversion. The goal, explicitly stated in many organizational documents, was assimilation, transforming these children of immigrants into proper Americans, which meant white, Protestant, and disconnected from their ethnic roots. Speaking Italian or Yiddish or Polish in their new homes was often forbidden. Old World customs were stamped out. Within a generation, children lost all connection to their cultural inheritance. The documentation that might have preserved these identities has conveniently disappeared. Intake records that would show children's original names, parents' information, and circumstances of surrender are missing from archives across multiple institutions. Some organizations claim fires destroyed their records, though these fires are curiously undocumented. Others blame reorganizations, during which boxes of files were accidentally discarded. When descendants request information about their orphan train ancestors, they're typically told that privacy laws prevent disclosure, or that the relevant documents simply no longer exist. The few records that survive are often fragmentary, a name here, a date there, never enough to reconstruct a complete story. This pattern of loss feels less like negligence and more like policy, a systematic effort to ensure that what really happened to these children could never be fully known or proven. The idealistic narrative of the orphan trains crumbles when confronted with simple economic reality. The program's peak years coincided exactly with the massive labor shortage plaguing Western agricultural expansion. As settlers pushed into the Great Plains and beyond, they faced brutal workloads with insufficient hands to manage them. Hired farmhands were expensive and unreliable, often moving on to claim their own homesteads. But children from the orphan trains were free, tied to families through what amounted to indentured servitude until adulthood, unable to leave even if conditions were harsh. Census records tell a story that organizations preferred to obscure. Researchers examining records from 1880 through 1920 have found that orphan-trained children were frequently listed not as sons or daughters, but as servants, hired help, farmhand, or simply laborer. Some families who took multiple children over the years listed them all as workers, suggesting these weren't adoptions at all, but labor acquisitions. One farmer in Nebraska took 7 boys over a 15-year period, all listed as farmhands in successive census records, none bearing his surname. This pattern repeats across states and decades, families acquiring children specifically sized to their labor needs, replacing them as they aged out with fresh arrivals from the next train. The financial arrangements raise further questions about motives. While families weren't charged adoption fees, neither were they required to pay the children wages, provide formal education beyond basic literacy, or guarantee inheritance rights. The children's labor belonged entirely to the family until age 18 or 21, depending on placement agreements. Some families received small subsidies from local governments to offset the cost of feeding and clothing these children, essentially being paid to acquire free workers. Placing organizations, meanwhile, received substantial donations from wealthy benefactors and counted each placement as a success, regardless of the child's actual conditions. The entire system operated on perverse incentives, where more placements meant more funding and oversight was minimal to non-existent. Court records from the era document what happened when this system was challenged. A Missouri case from 1897 involved a 14-year-old boy who ran away after being beaten for failing to complete impossible quotas of farm work. The family sued the Children's Aid Society for providing a defective child, arguing they'd been promised a strong worker. Other cases show children suing for back wages after years of unpaid labor, almost always losing because their placement agreements specifically exempted families from payment obligations. A particularly disturbing Illinois case from 1903 involved a girl who'd been sexually abused by her placement father. The court ruled that since she'd been placed for domestic service, the family's treatment of her was a private matter, unless she could prove she was legally adopted, which her altered paperwork made impossible. The abuse and exploitation weren't anomalies, but logical outcomes of a system that treated children as economic units rather than human beings with rights. When your value is measured entirely in labor output, when you can be returned like defective merchandise if you don't perform adequately, you're not a son or daughter, you're property with a different name.
The mathematics of the orphan trains have never quite added up. Departure manifests from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia frequently list different numbers of children than arrival records in Midwestern towns. A train leaving with 43 children might arrive with 40, the missing 3 explained away as having been placed at earlier stops, except no documentation exists for those intermediate placements. Sometimes the discrepancy runs the other way, with more children arriving than supposedly departed, suggesting kids were being added to trains at unknown points along the route. These aren't isolated incidents, but patterns repeated across decades, raising an unsettling question. If the organizations running these trains couldn't account for every child, who could? Some children vanish from records so completely as if they never existed. A boy named Michael Flanagan appears on a departure list from New York in 1887, then simply disappears. No placement record, no census entry, no death certificate, no trace. He's one of hundreds, possibly thousands, who entered the system and were never documented leaving it. Researchers attempting to trace these missing children hit walls of silence. The organizations that should have records claim they don't. Local authorities in receiving towns have no documentation of arrivals. It's statistically impossible for this many children to simply evaporate unless someone was ensuring they evaporated. The placement verification process, when it existed at all, was laughably inadequate. Families requesting children were supposed to provide references and submit to basic interviews, but enforcement was inconsistent at best. Some placing agents admitted in private correspondence that they accepted references without verification, grateful simply to have someone willing to take a child off their hands. Fake references were common, families vouching for each other in circular arrangements, or prominent community members providing blanket recommendations for anyone who asked. One Iowa sheriff later testified that a man known locally for cruelty had received 4 children over 6 years, all through glowing references from a pastor who admitted he'd never actually visited the man's farm. Modern DNA testing has begun to unravel some of these mysteries, though what it reveals is often more disturbing than the silence. Descendants who assumed their great-grandparents were siblings placed together have discovered through genetic testing that they share no blood relation at all. Children from different families given the same new surname and told they were brother and sister. Others have found that family stories about orphan train ancestors being twins are impossible. The children were born years apart in different states to different parents. Some DNA results suggest that children listed as orphans were actually the illegitimate offspring of wealthy families, quietly disposed of through the orphan train system to avoid scandal. Perhaps most troubling are the cases where DNA testing has connected orphan train descendants to families who never stopped searching. A woman in Ohio discovered through genetic genealogy that her orphan train grandmother had been taken from parents who spent decades placing newspaper advertisements looking for her, never knowing she'd been renamed, moved to Minnesota, and told her parents were dead. The grandmother herself had died believing she was unwanted, while her actual family grieved her as stolen. The archives exist, but accessing them requires navigating a maze of restrictions that seem designed more to protect reputations than preserve history. The New York Foundling Hospital, which sent thousands of children west, maintains records that are sealed for 100 years after a child's placement, a policy that conveniently ensures most direct witnesses are dead before information becomes available. The Children's Aid Society, while maintaining a public archive, restricts access to sensitive materials that require special permission to view, permission that researchers report is frequently denied without clear justification. When descendants request their own family records, they're often told that adoption laws prevent disclosure, even for people who died decades ago. The message is clear. Some stories are meant to stay buried. The destruction of records follows patterns too consistent to be accidental.
Multiple organizations involved in orphan train placements have reported fires that destroyed their archives, fires that somehow left other institutional records intact while consuming only child placement files. The Catholic Home Bureau lost its records in an office reorganization in the 1950s. Several Protestant placement agencies claimed their files were inadvertently discarded during moves to new facilities. When pressed, archivists offer apologetic shrugs and note that record-keeping standards were different in the past. But immigrants' aid societies from the same era somehow managed to preserve their documentation. Settlement houses kept meticulous records. The orphan train files, specifically, are what disappeared. Descendants who attempt legal action to access information face obstacles erected specifically to prevent discovery. Adoption records from the orphan train era are sealed by state laws that retroactively apply modern privacy standards to historical placements.
Courts have consistently ruled that even adult descendants have no legal right to information about their ancestors' placements, arguing that revealing this information might harm the privacy interests of families who took orphan train children, families who, in most cases, are themselves long dead. Appeals based on genealogical research, medical necessity, or historical documentation have been denied. The system protects the institutions and the families who benefited, not the children who suffered or their descendants seeking truth. The involvement of prominent families in suppressing investigation adds another layer of complexity. Many of the wealthiest families in Midwestern states built their fortunes on farms worked by orphan train children. These families have endowed universities, funded historical societies, and hold significant influence over which stories get told and which get quietly forgotten. When researchers have attempted to publish findings about specific placements involving prominent families, they've faced legal threats, funding cuts, and academic pressure to soften their conclusions. One historian researching orphan train placements in Kansas reported that her university's board, which included descendants of families who'd taken orphan train children, pressured her department to deny her tenure unless she abandoned the project. The silence isn't passive neglect, but active maintenance. Someone is still deciding which files can be opened and which must stay closed, which stories deserve investigation and which should be left alone. The question is not whether there's a cover-up, but why it continues more than a century after the last orphan train ran. When researchers map orphan train placements geographically, certain regions light up with concentrations that defy coincidence. Western Pennsylvania, with its coal mines and steel mills, received waves of older boys during industrial boom periods. The wheat belt of Kansas and Nebraska shows clusters of placements timed precisely to harvest seasons and homesteading pushes. Textile mill towns in Massachusetts took primarily girls aged 10 to 14, exactly the demographic preferred for factory work. These aren't random distributions, but strategic deployments of child labor to regions experiencing acute worker shortages. The children went where the work was, following economic demand with the precision of a supply chain. The same names appear repeatedly in placement records across different states and decades, suggesting networks rather than independent charitable efforts. A placing agent named Edmund Trask shows up in documents from Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri between 1882 and 1903, always working with the same 3 or 4 receiving families, who collectively took over 60 children during that period.
Another agent, Sarah Glenmont, placed children exclusively with families connected to a specific Methodist congregation that stretched across Nebraska and Wyoming, creating what amounts to a closed distribution system. When researchers trace these recurring names, they often lead to family connections, business partnerships, or shared memberships in fraternal organizations, relationships that suggest coordination and mutual benefit rather than charitable spontaneity. The correlation between placement surges and labor crises is too precise to ignore. During the 1870s railroad expansion, placements to towns along new rail lines spiked dramatically. The 1880s agricultural boom brought waves of children to farming communities.
When textile mills in New England faced labor shortages in the 1890s, orphan train routes suddenly included Massachusetts mill towns that had never received children before. Economic historians examining these patterns have noted that orphan train children functioned essentially as mobile labor reserves, deployed to industries and regions experiencing acute workforce needs. The language used in organizational correspondence supports this interpretation. Children were described in terms of their utility, their capacity for work, their value to communities needing hands. Perhaps most disturbing are the ideological connections to the eugenics movement that gained prominence during the orphan train's peak years. Charles Loring Brace himself wrote extensively about improving stock and removing children from degenerate urban environments before they could reproduce. Placement preference for Northern European-looking children reflected eugenic theories about superior and inferior races. Several prominent board members of orphan train organizations also served on eugenics society boards, and the language of racial improvement permeates organizational documents from the 1890s through the 1920s. Some states that received large numbers of orphan train children later passed aggressive sterilization laws targeting the feeble-minded and inferior, categories that frequently included children of immigrants, the very population the orphan trains had drawn from. The patterns reveal a system operating with clear intent rather than humanitarian impulse. These weren't random acts of charity, but coordinated efforts serving economic interests, ideological agendas, and labor demands. The dots connect not to rescue, but to redistribution of children, of labor, of genetic material deemed desirable or disposable by those who held the power to decide. The DNA revolution has cracked open secrets that institutional silence tried to keep buried. A woman in Oregon submitted her genetic material to a genealogy database hoping to find distant cousins, only to discover that her orphan-trained grandfather, who'd been told his entire life he was Irish, was actually Italian. His name changed from Benedetto Russo to Benjamin Ross. A man in Texas learned through DNA testing that his great-grandmother, placed as a sole orphan in 1893, actually had 4 siblings who'd been separated and sent to different states. None ever told the others existed. These aren't isolated revelations, but an avalanche of contradictions between official stories and genetic truth. DNA doesn't forget what records claimed never happened. Family oral histories, long dismissed as confused or embellished, are being validated by documentary evidence. One family insisted for generations that their orphan-train ancestor had been stolen from a mother who'd only agreed to temporary placement during illness.
Historians dismissed this as family mythology until a researcher found the mother's letters in a historical society collection 3 states away, desperate pleas to get her daughter back, returned unopened or answered with form letters stating the placement was permanent and beneficial. Another family's story about their ancestor being taken from a playground was confirmed when a newspaper article from 1891 surfaced, describing police removing children from a neighborhood for vagrancy, the playground sweeps that fed the orphan train system. The children's own voices are emerging from attics and estate sales, tucked into diaries and letters that families kept but never fully understood. A diary purchased at an Iowa auction in 2019 belonged to a girl named Catherine who rode an orphan train in 1888. Her entries describe being told to lie about her age, being coached on what to say to potential families, watching agents accept money from farmers in exchange for strong boys despite official policies against payment.
Letters discovered in a Kansas farmhouse describe siblings writing to each other in secret, maintaining contact despite being forbidden to do so, eventually losing touch when one family moved without forwarding information. These first-hand accounts contradict nearly every element of the official narrative, describing coercion, deception, and systematic exploitation rather than rescue. Contemporary researchers are assembling these fragments into a coherent counter-narrative, using tools unavailable to previous generations. Digital databases allow cross-referencing of census records, ship manifests, newspaper archives, and death certificates in ways that reveal patterns invisible when examining documents individually. Crowdsourced genealogy projects connect descendants who discover their ancestors were on the same trains, placed in the same towns, or separated from each other. Academic historians are partnering with descendant communities to access family materials that never made it into official archives, the private letters, the whispered stories, the photographs with names written on the back that contradict official records. What's emerging is a history that institutions tried to erase but couldn't completely destroy. The evidence survived in DNA, in family memory, in documents scattered across a continent. Each discovery adds another piece to a puzzle that reveals not a rescue mission, but something far more calculated, more extensive, and more devastating than official histories ever acknowledged. The children's truth is finally overtaking the institution's lies.
The trauma doesn't end with the generation that experienced it. Descendants of orphan-trained children report patterns of attachment disorders, mistrust of institutions, and family silences that span multiple generations. One woman describes how her grandmother, an orphan-trained survivor, never hugged her own children and forbade talk of the past, creating an emotional coldness that infected the entire family line. Another recalls his grandfather's nightmares that continued into his 80s, always the same, standing on a platform while strangers examined him, calling for a sister whose name he could no longer remember. Psychologists studying intergenerational trauma recognize these patterns. The wounds of separation, identity erasure, and exploitation don't heal in a single lifetime, but echo forward, shaping how families love, trust, and connect across generations. The orphan trains weren't unique, but part of a broader pattern of institutionalized child removal that includes Native American boarding schools and Australia's stolen generations.
All three systems operated under the same paternalistic logic. Certain children were better off separated from their families and cultures, placed with superior families or institutions that would civilize, Christianize, and assimilate them. All three targeted marginalized populations, the poor, the indigenous, the colonized.
All three prioritized cultural erasure and labor extraction over genuine child welfare. And all three were celebrated in their time as progressive reform, humanitarian rescue, necessary intervention. The fact that similar systems emerged across different countries and contexts suggests something deeper than isolated policy failures, a willingness to treat certain children as raw material for social engineering projects designed by those in power. Despite everything researchers have uncovered, fundamental questions remain unanswered and likely always will. We'll never know exactly how many children rode the trains. Estimates range from 150,000 to 400,000, a stunning variation that reflects the inadequacy of record-keeping or perhaps its deliberate sabotage. We'll never know how many had living parents who wanted them back.
We'll never know how many disappeared into abusive situations with no intervention, how many died unreported, how many spent their lives searching for siblings they'd been told didn't exist. The destroyed records, the sealed archives, the century of institutional silence have created gaps that no amount of research can fill. Some truths are lost forever, which may have been the point all along. Confronting these uncomfortable truths about institutions that presented themselves as charitable forces us to question how we assess historical benevolence. The orphan trains were praised by newspapers, funded by wealthy philanthropists, supported by churches and civic organizations. Good people believed they were doing good work. But good intentions never justify removing children from families, erasing their identities, and extracting their labor. The willingness to celebrate the orphan trains for over a century without seriously examining the children's actual experiences reveals our cultural preference for comfortable narratives over difficult truths. We want to believe that charity is always kind, that institutions mean well, that the powerful act in the interests of the vulnerable. The orphan trains remind us that sometimes the most dangerous systems are those wrapped in the language of salvation. Acknowledging this doesn't dishonor genuine charitable work. It protects future children from suffering similar fates under different names.